Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll get started if more people filter on in as we go. That's quite all right too. So welcome everyone. This is our January meeting of the New Bedford Civil War Roundtable. Uh, a few years ago, we made a choice that we would do our January and February meetings on Zoom because nobody likes to go out in this weather. Don't tend to get as quite as large of a group for the Zoom meetings, but the fortunate thing is that we get to bring in folks that normally would not be able to join us in person because of geographic reasons. And so tonight we're very lucky to be able to welcome Dan from Eisenhower National Historic Site to speak with us tonight. Before we do that, just some housekeeping items. Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the book award applications have gone out
That's
uh,
right.
to the local
Yes,
school.
and I've received a couple of acknowledgments that they did receive them, Mark, and I've established a deadline of April the 17th for all the applications to come on in and sent to me directly, and that's when I look through them and then share them with Jack Richer so we can come to a mutual decision in respect to one award, two awards, or three awards, whatever the group seems to think is favorable for this year. But they've gone out to all of the 8 guidance counselors for the 8 schools that are part of our book award program.
Excellent. So if you know anybody in a local school district who may be a graduating senior, who may be a good fit for it, definitely let them know to talk to their guidance departments and apply. So we'll be looking forward to that. The other thing to note is the cemetery cleaning, and you may have heard brief mention of this earlier. The first step in the project for the rural cemetery work that hopefully we'll do for those graves there in the Civil War plot is to catalog, to get pictures, and to take documentary evidence of what we see there now. So more on that to come. I'm not rushing into that in this cold weather. But that is a project that it makes sense to do before it gets super warm outside too. So I have not selected a date for that yet, but we'll have a day of service. So if anybody's interested in helping out with that, more emails to come. We'll pick a date, probably a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon or something like that, and can go out there and hopefully we can document most of the graves in a single day. So more on that to come though when the weather starts to get a little bit warmer. I think that's all I really had for updates this evening. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. We're joined by Park Ranger Daniel Vermilya. He is a park ranger at Eisenhower National Historic Site in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The other National Park Service site, which you should all definitely visit if you have never been there. Unfortunately, I think it's often overlooked by visitors to Gettysburg, but a beautiful farm, beautiful site, and a very important story, certainly, about President Eisenhower. He has previously worked at Gettysburg National Military Park, Monocacy National Battlefield, and Antietam National Battlefield. He has written several books on the Civil War, and he lives in Gettysburg with his wife and 2 children. Today, Dan will be talking to us about Ike and the Civil War. So, without any further ado, Dan, the virtual room is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Nice to be here and to join you all. Yeah, this is a beautiful National Park Service site that we have here in Gettysburg, the other national park of Gettysburg. And the story of the Eisenhower Farm, this is such a beautiful place. I'm going to go ahead and pull my screen up. Uh, yep, you're not seeing that. Hold on just a minute. Are you seeing my main screen?
We are, yeah, we're seeing the PowerPoint.
Okay. It's goofy on my end here. All right. Nope. Still doing that. All right. We're going to try this instead. Nope. Okay. Hold on just a moment.
Mhm.
It's popping up on my second screen here.
So we can see the PowerPoint
Yeah.
screen right before you go into presentation mode is what we're seeing. So,
All right, let's try. There we go. How about now?
yep, perfect.
All right, sorry about that, folks. All right, so our topic is Ike and the Civil War. We'll just dive right in here before I have any more confusing PowerPoint issues. So when so many people think of Gettysburg in presidential history, right, we think of this picture or a scene like this, November 19th of 1863. Here in town, Lincoln is such a force for the tourism industry. He has such a story to tell. The Lincoln presence in Gettysburg is strong. But here at the Eisenhower site, we like to remind folks that Lincoln was not the only president to have a significant Gettysburg story. There was another president, our very own Dwight Eisenhower, for whom Gettysburg was a vital part of his life for decades. In fact, and we'll come back to this towards the end of our program, Eisenhower spoke in that same national cemetery on November 19th of 1963 for the 100th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. For Eisenhower, history came to be something that was instructive, that changed and influenced the course of his life. And Gettysburg was a big part of that for him for a long time. Even Gettysburg, before he had ever set foot here, was already shaping him because the home that he would one day own here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was a witness to the battle that took place here. But this landscape that he settled on, they bought this property in 1950. This landscape that they intended to use as a retirement home became an important part of who Ike was. He had formative professional experiences on the battlefield. The battle and its leaders informed his own views on leadership. He was also an amateur battlefield tour guide for his guests in Gettysburg, which I think is a fascinating part of this. You think about a former Supreme Allied Commander and President of the United States giving folks battlefield tours. I would love to listen in on one of those. And also, he spent considerable time reflecting on the meaning of the battle and the meaning of the American Civil War. So let's talk a little bit about this property that he bought here in Gettysburg. The Eisenhower farm here in 1863. So there are surveys going back showing this property all the way to 1750 through various owners. By the time of the battle, a gentleman by the name of John Besecker owned the farm. He purchased the property in 1851. You can see towards the bottom center of this map, there is a J. Besecker and a William Douglas towards the bottom center of this map. That is the historic Eisenhower farmstead here that the Eisenhowers would one day own. By 1860, John Besecker was leasing the property to Adam Bollinger, his wife, and their two children. There was a neighboring property, which we call Farm 2 today, that Eisenhower used for his cattle herd. That was owned by Mr. William Douglas, and there was a Farm 3, a nearby property owned by a Samuel Pitzer. Together today, those are all part of Eisenhower National Historic Site. Well, at the time of the battle, these farms are sitting right behind the front lines of combat. You can see on this blue map here off to the side, the red lines of battle for the Confederate. A. Bollinger is right behind there. So the Eisenhower property, or the future Eisenhower property, did not figure very large into the fighting at Gettysburg on July 1st. But on July 2nd, this farm is sitting right behind the right flank of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. I'm not going to do a deep dive on the story of the battle, but for those who are familiar with Gettysburg and its story, suffice to say, if you've heard of places like Little Round Top, which I'm willing to bet that you have, if you've heard of one hill from the American Civil War, it's probably Little Round Top. So everybody, more or less, who's fighting in the area of Little Round Top, which you can see on this map here, this blue map, troops that are fighting in the area of Devil's Den, fighting in the area of the Peach Orchard, they're all moving right through or adjacent to this farm that President Eisenhower would one day own. So there's some pretty heavy fighting going on just on the other side of the ridge from Mr. Bollinger's house and his property here. And after the battle, as evidence of it, Adam Bollinger filed a damage claim for $441 with the state of Pennsylvania. Claim was approved, but he never received anything. And he also filed a claim with the U.S. federal government for $1,700. And the federal government, which they were wont to do upon many occasions, especially with fighting here in the North, they denied the claim on the grounds that all of the damage was caused by Confederates, as it was Confederates moving specifically through the farm. So, hey, we didn't do that. Go talk to Jeff Davis down in Richmond. Neighboring properties also filed damage claims as well. This farm was a witness to destruction during the Battle of Gettysburg. And because it was this historic property, this leads us to 1950 now. We'll jump forward 100 years into the story to get to the Eisenhower storyline. One of the big selling points for this farm for the Eisenhowers was its Civil War connection. So by 1950, Dwight Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University, and he and Mamie were looking towards retirement. They had been married for 34 years, and in 34 years of marriage, they moved 38 times. During Eisenhower's military career, while Ike became this famous five-star general, he was also a staff officer for a long time. He was a captain, he was a major, he was a lieutenant colonel. He was posted around the United States and around the world, living in Panama, in France, and the Philippines. So Ike and Mamie, they never had a place of their own to actually own a home together. So by 1950, they're in Columbia at New York, and they're thinking, hey, it's time to start settling down and looking for that special place. Ike had written Mamie a letter in 1943 during the war years saying, dreaming of one day when all this was over, let's find a quiet place far away from cities. And this farm was that quiet place. It's a beautiful property. It's serene. Ike specifically wanted it to be a farm, but he also was very drawn to this because it is quite literally right next door to Gettysburg National Military Park. So they bought this property, and no sooner have they bought this farm than Ike was asked by President Truman to become the Supreme Commander of NATO forces. So after a year of leading NATO, Ike puts that role aside, runs for president, and he ends up using this property here extensively during his presidency before it finally became his retirement home in the 1960s. But it's interesting that this farm owned by the president, it's sharing a border with the battlefield. So it's seeing the evolution of Gettysburg National Military Park. This photo is taken of the farm from the 1970s from an observation tower on the Gettysburg battlefield. So it is literally right next door to the park. But it's interesting as well that on the boundary of this farm, when Eisenhower is owning this property, just on this boundary of this farm, there are still monuments going up along West Confederate Avenue in Gettysburg. Monuments to southern states, such as South Carolina and Georgia. Some of these seeing speeches that are very, very lost cause oriented. We'll come back to that term a little bit later on, the lost cause view of the Civil War. It's also interesting that the President of the United States owns a farm on the boundary of a major national park with lots of visitation. The Secret Service was adamant that the very tower this picture was taken from be closed when the president was at home. And I think looking at this picture, many of you might understand why. You have a clear view to the president's home and barn from this observation tower. So it's an interesting challenge, I think, for the Park Service with the sitting president having a farm right next to the battlefield landscape there. They wanted to make sure that that part of the park was always in pristine condition. When the big boss is at home nearby, you want the park to be looking nice. Because Ike had a presence on the battlefield during these years, as we'll talk about more later, as a place to visit. As you'll see here on the left, that's he and Mamie at the Pennsylvania Memorial in 1955. And then on the right, that is a picture of Eisenhower visiting the Cyclorama painting building here in Gettysburg upon its grand opening in 1963. So Eisenhower has this connection through his farm, but on a broader level, he has a connection with Gettysburg because of the role history plays in Eisenhower's life. These are quotes from Ike's memoir, At Ease, where he says, "My first reading love was ancient history." And he went on to say this, "For me, the reading of history was an end in itself, not a source of lessons to guide us in the present or to prepare me for the future. I did not know what opportunities were there for learning. I read for history for history's sake, for myself alone." I'm sure many of you might agree with that history is something that we do as a hobby or something that we do out of our passion and joy for it. But I think you would also agree that the way Eisenhower eventually came to view history for its utility as well. But he did know, growing up in Abilene, Kansas in the 1890s, he's knowing and interacting Civil War veterans. So he wrote, had one of our Civil War veterans, for instance, suggested that not many years later I would visit Gettysburg to study the tactics of the great battlefield where he had fought, my reaction would have been, me? Eisenhower had interesting thoughts on the battle here. He saw the battle much deeper than the famous places that so many know. He saw it as a demonstration of courage. Gettysburg, in fact, was a demonstration of what a tiny portion of a nation's number can accomplish in the shaping and making of history. And in his writings, in his memoirs, he called out specific individuals such as George Meade, Frank Haskell, and Isaac Trimble as examples of moral courage in the battle. And these thoughts were developed not only through reading about history, but also through his visits to Gettysburg. This photograph was taken on the steps of Christ Lutheran Church on May 4th of 1915. This was the first time that Dwight Eisenhower visited Gettysburg. He visited with his West Point class, famously the class the stars fell on because so many members of the class went on to reach the rank of general during their careers. 59 members became generals. And in case anybody's looking in the photograph, I see a couple of folks leaning forward, probably trying to pick out where Ike is, right? Yeah? Well, I'll make it easy for you. How about that? Saved you a little bit of time in the process there. So there's a young cadet, Dwight Eisenhower, and also there's a young Omar Bradley as well. Omar Bradley also in Ike's West Point class. This was a staff ride, an attempt for Eisenhower to visit the battlefield with his West Point class. Long tradition of military groups using the battlefield for that purpose here. 3 years later, Eisenhower came back in a more official capacity when he commanded Camp Colt, the tank training camp located on the Gettysburg battlefield during World War I. Eisenhower was the commander of Camp Colt. This was not the assignment that he wanted in 1918. He wanted to be sent to France to get combat experience. Instead, he sent to Gettysburg, the scene of the last big war. But it ended up being a good thing for him because he really grew as a leader here. It's his first independent command. He's getting to interface with British officers who are coming as military advisors for the Americans for tank warfare. He's getting to deal with challenges like how do you train soldiers for tank warfare without tanks? Well, you put guns on flatbed trucks and drive them around the battlefield for target practice. That's what he did. He's also encountering challenges like the influenza pandemic of 1918, taking a heavy toll on the camp. Ike grew a lot as a leader through his time here at Camp Colt, even spending time being inspired by the landscape, going up to the National Cemetery to find the place where Lincoln spoke when he delivered the Gettysburg Address as a source of inspiration for him. And while he's here, he's certainly gaining an appreciation for some of the leaders of Gettysburg, including Abraham Lincoln. And what you're seeing here is a portrait Eisenhower himself actually did of Lincoln later in life. Ike became a painter when he was in his late 50s and painted through the end of his life. Lincoln really was one of Eisenhower's true heroes in life, along with George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Robert E. Lee. Those are the four Americans whose portraits he hung in the Oval Office. But Ike gave a speech at Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky in 1954 where he said, Abraham Lincoln has always seemed to me to represent all that is best in America, in terms of its opportunity and the readiness of Americans always to raise up and exalt those people who live by truth, whose lives are examples of integrity and dedication to our country. He was a great leader. I would like to remind you of the methods he used in leadership. You can find no instance when he stood up in public and excoriated another American. You can find no instance where he is reported to have slapped or pounded the table and struck the pose of a pseudo-dictator or arbitrary individual. Eisenhower really tried to model his own temperament and leadership style after Lincoln. I think if you took some of the names out of these quotes here, you could think, oh, this is somebody possibly describing Eisenhower himself. Ike had similar thoughts on George Gordon Meade, the victor of Gettysburg. It's a pet peeve of mine that so many say how Lee lost the Battle of Gettysburg. I think maybe we should reframe it to think more how George Meade won the battle. That's, again, a little pet peeve of mine, back to Eisenhower. Ike certainly thought highly of George Meade, saying that Meade's claim to greatness in that moment when he was given command of the Army of the Potomac 3 days before the battle may very well be evidenced by the total absence of the theatrical. When thousands of lives were at stake, there was no time for postures or declamations, something Eisenhower himself aspired to, the lack of theatrics. He once, in the 1930s, was a staff officer for Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. And when Eisenhower was asked later on what he learned from MacArthur, he said it was a study in theatrics. Interesting quote. He also said of Meade, "Here was a man that knew he had to win the battle up here," referring to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, "because the man was an invader. Mr. Lee was an invader. If he lost the battle here, this was far worse than losing the Battle of Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville or Second Bull Run or anything else." Eisenhower also had very high thoughts about Lee. He received criticism for having Lee's portrait in the Oval Office. And in a response to one concerned citizen, he wrote, "General Robert E. Lee was, in my estimation, one of the supremely gifted men produced by our nation. He believed unswervingly in the constitutional validity of his cause, which until 1865 was still an arguable question in America. He was a poised and inspiring leader, true to the high trust reposed in him by millions of his fellow citizens. He was thoughtful yet demanding of his officers and men, forbearing with captured enemies, but ingenious, unrelenting, and personally courageous in battle, and never disheartened by a reverse or obstacle." Again, if you take the names out, you can see that Eisenhower really did try to model his own leadership after these leading figures of the American Civil War. And studying these leaders was very important for Eisenhower, but so was also the time he just spent out on the battlefield landscape, whether it was his early years at Camp Colt or when he's president of the United States or a retiree living here in the 1960s. Eisenhower spent time taking others on tours of Gettysburg, imparting his knowledge and opinions of the battle. And these visits really showed Ike in his element, someone who could relate to people, sharing his passion for history in one of his favorite places. Among these individuals is Bruce Catton, the famed writer, visited Gettysburg in October of 1962, spent time with Ike at his office at Gettysburg College, and also spent some time here seen at the High Watermark Monument on Cemetery Ridge in Gettysburg. Perhaps none of these visitors drew as much press coverage, we might say, as Bernard Montgomery, the famous British field marshal from the Second World War. Montgomery and Eisenhower had a fascinating relationship. It was tense at times. Montgomery could be very critical of Eisenhower, very high of his own self with his opinions. But they had a strong foundation for their relationship, and evidenced by you wouldn't invite somebody you disdained to come stay at your home and take them on a tour of the battlefield. So Montgomery came and visited Ike in May of 1957. And I will add, by the way, that Mamie Eisenhower said Bernard Montgomery was her favorite house guest. He visited Ike in May of 1957, and they took a battlefield tour together with Ike as the tour guide. Here they are seen up on Little Round Top. I use this to remind visitors that unless you won the Second World War, we ask that you stay off the boulders. Good. I'm glad that joke still works. I'm seeing some heads nodding. Good. Yeah, so they're visiting May of 1957. And before Montgomery got to Gettysburg, he gave remarks in Baltimore where he was critical of Robert E. Lee, saying that he would have sacked Lee and Meade for their performance at the battle. Well, it's 1957. The press doesn't care that he criticized George Meade. The press cares that he criticized Robert E. Lee. As they're touring the battlefield landscape, you can see in this picture at the Virginia Memorial, there's a camera off to the side. They have some press with them, following the President of the United States and this former British field marshal around the landscape. In Montgomery, with cameras nearby, simply can't help himself. He has to keep opining and giving his thoughts on Gettysburg and what a bad job these generals did. And he keeps criticizing Robert E. Lee. Ike tried to deflect some of the growing tension by saying, if some of the generals who fought here were alive today, they probably would have criticized the way we fought, and Monty nodded in agreement. Along the way, they stopped at the Gettysburg Museum looking at relics from the war. They saw the old electric map with Ike and Monty in the first row of the seating here. Anybody here ever see the old electric map in Gettysburg on a visit years ago? Yeah, good. Still a lot of people ask about it. It was a classic. I remember it fondly myself. I think this photograph perhaps captures how Eisenhower may have felt by the end of Montgomery's visit, that he wishes the cannon may have had a charge in it. Montgomery created some headaches for the sitting president. As a Republican looking to advance civil rights legislation, Eisenhower did not need to anger the South any more than he had to. Montgomery criticized Robert E. Lee, which is something that you just did not do in public life in 1957 without drawing ire. After Montgomery left Gettysburg, there was quite the controversy. Time magazine wrote this, quoting a newspaper along the way. It was, as North Carolina's Durham Herald noted, one of those tempests in a teapot in which Americans delight to engage. It gives them a chance to argue without having to decide, to debate without some vital result depending on the outcome, which to me sounds a lot like social media today. But that's the controversy about this was enormous. Southern newspapers were irate. There were headlines criticizing the president, editorials criticizing his own leadership during the Second World War. Montgomery, after he left Gettysburg, went, of all places, on a speaking tour of the Deep South. Very bad choice on his part. He said, "I suppose that battle never had so much publicity since it was fought." Not all of Eisenhower's visits went this way. Here he is pictured examining a cannon on the landscape with French President Charles de Gaulle. This was April of 1960, on a day which the temperature reached over 100 degrees. De Gaulle was visiting Eisenhower in Gettysburg to prepare for an upcoming summit with the Soviets that was not to take place due to the U-2 spy plane incident that happened shortly after this visit. But here you see Eisenhower and de Gaulle with the statue of Robert E. Lee atop the Virginia Memorial just behind them. So Eisenhower, through these visits as president, is using the battlefield for diplomacy as well, with de Gaulle here, not pictured. Sir Winston Churchill, who visited Ike in 1959 in May. Churchill was no longer prime minister at this point, but Eisenhower still took his guest on a helicopter tour of the Gettysburg battlefield. This was representative of how he used his farm here at Gettysburg as well, and that when people came to visit him at the property, if it wasn't a battlefield tour, he at least gave them a tour of the farm, showed them his cattle herd as a way of sharing something of himself with others. And this is all an interesting backdrop for Ike in the Civil War, considering when he is living in Gettysburg. He is living here during the 1950s, off and on during his presidency. But the most time he spends in Gettysburg is in the 1960s, when he is a retiree. January 20th of 1961, Ike and Mamie leave the White House, they come back to Gettysburg, and for the next 8 years, this is home until Ike's death in 1969. And then Mamie lived here another 10 years beyond that. But for Eisenhower in the 1960s, this is during the Civil War centennial, and he's living in Gettysburg. He is caught up in this. He had issued a proclamation about the centennial towards the end of his time in office, but as a private citizen, a well-known and well-regarded private citizen, he is a sought-after speaker at several centennial events. So let's take a look at a couple of these. The first one I find to be fascinating. It is not at all what you would think, a former president of the United States speaking at the rededication of a Confederate cemetery in Hagerstown, Maryland. This is a place where many of the Confederate dead from Antietam, the September 1862 battle, were buried. Well, Eisenhower spoke at the dedication for a monument there at Washington Confederate Cemetery in Hagerstown, September 3rd of 1961, where he said in part, Dedicated without reservation to the advancement of our faith and man's divine origin, we thank these men, now almost 100 years in their graves, for the inspiration they and their equally dedicated opponents in that war have given us in their shining example of courage, endurance, and fidelity. May we always, in the long and bitter contest stretching out before us, feel our convictions as deeply and so faithfully sustain them as they. Couple things to take away from this. The president is speaking specifically of Confederate soldiers who were fighting against the United States government. In 1961, this is the prevailing view of the war. During the centennial, the country viewed the Civil War in a much different light than how popular memory views the Civil War today. Memory of conflicts changes over time, dramatically in some cases. We might say that Eisenhower was a product of his time and how he viewed the Confederacy. He lionized Robert E. Lee. He thought the Confederate soldiers were praiseworthy in their efforts. This is very much representative of 1961. It's something that you did not see as much during the sesquicentennial, the 150th in recent times, and certainly with debates about the memory of the war and monumentation. It's a prevailing opinion that has lessened and lessened in public discourse today. So first of all, to be clear, it is the former president speaking about Confederates here, that they're shining example of courage. But also interesting to note, he's using that example of Confederate courage with the backdrop of the Cold War. When he says the long and bitter contest stretching out before us, he's talking about the battle between democracy and communism. Eisenhower filtered his thoughts on the Civil War, on the Cold War through the prism of history, using the past examples of the Civil War all around him here in Gettysburg, or in this case, about an hour's drive from his home in Hagerstown, as a lens through which we can draw inspiration from the past for the challenges we face in the present and the future. Eisenhower's time studying Gettysburg, from Camp Colt to his time here during his presidency, to the books he read at the battle, to the thoughts he had on the leaders, was all filtered through how can these lessons be instructive for me and for our country. And you see that here with these remarks. You can also see that with his speech for the 100th anniversary of the battle, where he is pictured here speaking at Gettysburg High School, June 30th of 1963. He spoke for nearly an hour to an outdoor crowd, and he spoke of perils to liberty, saying in part, in their dedication to freedom, thousands upon thousands of our countrymen have given their lives. Millions have stepped forward to offer a similar sacrifice. Thus, they gave us freedom and self-government to preserve, cherish, use, and pass on to the future. If our minds are truly responsive to the eloquence of Lincoln, our hearts will be filled with love of freedom and country, and our wills dedicated to the furtherance of the great ideals of liberty, equality of opportunity, and human dignity for which America stands. Thus, we, in our time, shall win the battle for freedom. So everything I just said about that last speech, about using the past as a prism through which to view the Cold War, we're going to add a +1 to that for this speech. This speech was about using the example of Gettysburg as an opportunity for us to draw strength from in our battle with communism abroad. Eisenhower also spoke about the need for, quote, citizen self-reliance. He spoke about liberties being threatened by communism, really trying to use this as a rallying cry, but it was not universally well received. As an editorial in the Washington Post noted, Mr. Eisenhower did not mention the big issue of this 100th year after Gettysburg, the Negro and his civil rights. Eisenhower, 100 years after the Civil War, was not commenting on the glaring contradiction or ironies for the Civil War centennial. While the Civil War centennial was seeing lots of large-scale battle reenactments on Park Service battlefields, while the centennial was an opportunity for many new battle histories to be written, it also, for the most part, ignored one of the core legacies, or the core legacy of the Civil War. It ignored the fact that there were 4 million people set free out of bondage, out of slavery from the war. And then 100 years later, there were still those same people whose ancestors had been enslaved who were struggling to have free and equal rights in this country. That was not lost on some observers in the Civil War centennial commemorations. Well, Ike gets another opportunity to have a big speech here in 1963. And we mentioned this earlier in our program at the outset. When we think of Gettysburg in November 19th, so many Americans think of 1863. Well, if we go forward 100 years, Eisenhower was there. Now, President Kennedy had been invited to give the keynote address that day. He declined because he had an upcoming trip to Dallas. Kennedy was shot in Dallas 3 days after this. So Eisenhower, living in Gettysburg, was asked to be the keynote speaker. Here you see a wonderful photograph of he and Mamie arriving on the platform that day. And we see now again that image of Eisenhower speaking to the gathered crowd on Cemetery Hill. And I won't read you his entire speech, but I'd like to read you a section of it. Eisenhower very much was praising Lincoln's speech and using this as an updated version of the Gettysburg Address for Americans to reflect on the meaning of democracy. We read Lincoln's sentiments, we ponder his words. The beauty of the sentiments he expressed enthralls us. The majesty of his words holds us spellbound. But we have not paid to his message its just tribute until we ourselves live it. For well he knew that to live for country is a duty as demanding as is the readiness to die for it. So long as this truth remains our guiding light, self-government in this nation will never die. True to democracy's basic principle that all are created equal and endowed by the Creator with priceless human rights, the good citizen now, as always before, is called upon to defend the rights of others, as he does his own, to subordinate self to the country's good, to refuse to take the easy way today that may invite national disaster tomorrow, to accept the truth that the work still to be done awaits his doing. On this day of commemoration, Lincoln still asks of each of us, as clearly as he did of those who heard his words a century ago, to give that increased devotion to the cause for which soldiers in all our wars have given the last full measure of devotion. Our answer, the only worthy one we can render to the memory of the great emancipator, is ever to defend, protect, and pass on unblemished the coming generations, the heritage, the trust that Abraham Lincoln and all the ghostly legions of patriots of the past with unflinching faith in their God have bequeathed us, a nation free with liberty, dignity, and justice for all. First of all, I'll say this. When Ike wanted to, he was quite the wordsmith. When he wanted to be, he was very, very good. But you'll note in here, the good citizen is called upon to defend the rights of others. He's giving a speech with a more full embrace of civil rights for all Americans here. He's also defining what citizenship means, I think, using this opportunity to frame it. And he's saying the increased devotion to the cause for which soldiers in all our wars have given the last full measure. The cemetery he is speaking in, there are over 500 casualties of World War II who were brought back home and buried in this cemetery for interment, including 13 who died under Ike's command on D-Day. So he is speaking in a cemetery with men who died under his command buried there. That cannot be lost on us. After Ike's remarks, taps was played, and then he was followed on the platform by Marian Anderson, the famed gospel singer of the 20th century who had performed famously at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, April of 1939, for a crowd of 75,000 people after she was denied the right to play at Constitution Hall. That is, the same Marian Anderson joined Ike on the platform that day. So did a newspaper editor from Philadelphia named E. Washington Rhodes, who's pictured here as well, who gave a speech that was a full-throated embrace of civil rights and call for free and equal civil rights, noting in Rhodes's speech, 100 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, 100 years after the Gettysburg Address, the anguished expectations and hopes of Lincoln for a united nation remain unrealized, unfulfilled in American life. The present grave civil rights struggle attests to this melancholy, tragic fact. For Eisenhower, this was such a wonderful moment for him to speak in the cemetery 100 years after the Gettysburg Address. This place where, as a young Army officer at Camp Colt, he had gone seeking inspiration for himself early in his career. And I think it reminds us that Gettysburg has always been a place to explore the conflicted legacies of the Civil War, whether it was Eisenhower sorting through his thoughts on leadership, or our country to have conversations about monuments and how we remember this. This park is a place, and this community is a place for us to talk about these subjects. And so is the Eisenhower home as well, because the Eisenhower home in Gettysburg also has a number of representations of the Civil War. And I'd like to show you just a few of them here as we close our time together this evening. First of all, there are statues of George Meade and Robert E. Lee in the living room. Almost every visitor assumes it is Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee. So again, poor George Meade. We're in Gettysburg and people are thinking it's a statue of Grant. In the dining room, there are whiskey decanters from the Civil War centennial with artwork on them. On the left, you see that's depicting Jackson and Lee in their last meeting at Chancellorsville. There's also a Fort Sumter depiction on the other side of one of these. The books in the home. It's one of my favorite things about working here. There are over 900 books in the Eisenhower home, all original to the Eisenhowers. And so many of the titles are books that maybe you have read. Maybe they're popular titles about the war. Bruce Catton's trilogy on the Army of the Potomac. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's The Passing of the Armies. You see there with the Maltese Cross of the Fifth Corps. Other books, you have Burke Davis's Gray Fox, a biography of Robert E. Lee, and Stephen Ambrose's biography of Henry Halleck. As the story goes, Ike was very fond of Ambrose's biography of Halleck, and that's how he came to know Ambrose. Over time, we've come to know that Ambrose exaggerated his own relationship with Eisenhower. He didn't get to know him quite on the level that he portrayed, but certainly Ike did read Ambrose's book, and we know that because it's in our collection here. Other books in the home, biographies of Lincoln, including T. Harry Williams' multi-volume Lincoln Finds a General. In the den, there is a map of the Gettysburg battlefield, the Cope map. This one was a gift to Eisenhower by Nelson Rockefeller, and it is signed by George Gordon Meade. And lastly, in Ike's office, he has a small excerpt of the famous Gettysburg cyclorama. Remember, I mentioned earlier he went to go see the cyclorama building when it opened in 1962. This is a small excerpt of this large 360 painting from the 1880s of Pickett's charge, showing the fighting at the angle on July 3rd of 1863, hanging right above Ike's desk. And then the George P. A. Healy portrait of Lincoln sitting above Ike's shoulder in his office from 1860. A bust of a young Lincoln in the sun porch. And lastly, I think my favorite item in the home, this fireplace and mantle, which was originally part of the East Room of the White House, where it was on display from 1854 to 1873. It was removed during renovations during the Grant administration. And that is the time that the Eisenhowers were building, it was later gifted to the Eisenhowers in 1954 by their White House staff. And that was the time that the Eisenhowers were building most of their Gettysburg home. They tore down most of the original structure and built a largely new home in its place. So they incorporated this into their Gettysburg living room. This was in the East Room of the White House during the American Civil War, during the Lincoln administration. So it is a physical, tangible part of Lincoln's White House here in the Eisenhower home. And it reminds us of that connection between Ike and Lincoln, that strong connection between the two of them. I'll close with one more Eisenhower speech and quote. May of 1946, 1 year after VE Day, Eisenhower came to Gettysburg to deliver the commencement address at Gettysburg College, the same campus where he would one day have an office in his retirement. And in his speech, he said this to the students of Gettysburg. You here have been fortunate to live closely with the traditions of Lincoln and of Gettysburg. No other place and no other man in our history so sharply illustrates human ability to master personal emotions and personal inclinations on the one hand, material circumstances and material forces on the other. Lincoln's determination, honesty, and understanding and devotion brought our people at last through our greatest crisis. He goes on to say this of Lincoln. To few is given the extraordinary combination of qualities to carry the heavy burden that Lincoln bore. Fortunately, few are called upon to meet the tests he met. But to his basic genius for leadership was a willing acceptance of responsibility and a firm will to render honest service. And I think there, of all the connections between Ike and the Civil War, his love of Gettysburg, his time on the battlefield landscape, the strongest connection is that Dwight Eisenhower, as a leader, modeled himself after Abraham Lincoln. And you can hear it in that quote. A firm will to render honest service describes both of them quite well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen on my end and come back up with my video here to say thank you for having me, and I'd be happy to chat a little bit if anybody has any questions on our topic this evening or about Eisenhower in general.
Thank you, Dan, so much for that presentation. If folks want to unmute yourselves and ask a question, you're more than welcome to, or if you want to type a question into the chat, I'm happy to read them too. So there is one question in the chat already from Kathleen. Are there any signs indicating where Camp Colt was found on the Gettysburg battlefield?
Yes, there's a wayside marker along the Emmitsburg Road south of Gettysburg, and a couple little markers here and there. But Camp Colt essentially stretched from the southern end of the town of Gettysburg all the way south through the battlefield to the Peach Orchard. It was a massive, massive camp. Over 10,000 soldiers came through Camp Colt during its existence. There were barracks, there were massive tents, there was a baseball field, a parade grounds, a large machine shop as part of the camp, railroad tracks running through it to get the men through the town to the railroad station. It was a very, very large presence. So most of the central heart of Gettysburg, the whole terrain of Pickett's Charge was all Camp Colt. Any questions?
So feel free, you are all on mute. So if you want to hit that microphone at the bottom of your screen, that will unmute you if you have a question.
Hey, Dan, question, what if, insofar as visitors to the farm, what if George Patton had ever visited? What do you imagine what that would been like?
Well, we do get asked a lot if Patton came here. He obviously didn't because he passed away at the end of 45 there. But I don't know. I mean, they had a good relationship. I would say that it was strained at times. In war, that happens. One of the reasons Ike was in the position he was in was because he was able to handle all those relationships and those personalities. Patton did come to Gettysburg twice early in his life, I believe. Once was, let's say, 1909, and then again a couple years later, Patton came on visits to the battlefield. The military was using it for staff rides, things like that. So he came a couple times. He was familiar with the landscape from that, and his own grandfather fought in Pickett's Charge as well. Patton's grandfather did. So my guess, if Patton had come here and they had taken a tour of the property, Patton probably would have been, he wouldn't have been criticizing the Confederacy, I'll say that. He would have probably spent a lot of time with Ike on the grounds of Pickett's Charge, exploring that terrain. That's my guess. Did that answer your question all right?
Yes, thank you. Are there still Angus beef on the farm?
There are, yeah. So Ike had a large cattle herd that ended up being sold off in 1967 before he passed away. But today, a local farmer does keep part of his herd here. On a clear day, I can see him right outside my office window here.
Hello, Dan.
Yeah.
Have you ever had an opportunity to visit the Eisenhower site in Abilene, Kansas?
I have not. So a good
I can
friend of
describe it
mine.
for you a little bit to appreciate it. I visited that maybe about 20 years ago with my family on our trip out west. And if everyone's looking at Dan right now, The Eisenhower home where he was born is at the bottom of Dan's tie. That's where his home is located. When you move like 6 o'clock, when you move over to 9 o'clock, that's where you find the huge statue of Eisenhower with his short little jacket that he would wear. If you go to Dan's head at midnight, what you see is the Eisenhower Library. And then over at 3 o'clock, to Dan's left, would be the Memorial Chapel, where Eisenhower is buried right next to Mamie Eisenhower and the relocated son, David Dowd Eisenhower. They lay all three of them. And that chapel is open 24 hours a day, right through the night, all night long. So what you have essentially is, in one 2-acre site, a man's life, from beginning to the war, to the presidency, to the end of his life. It's really very, very unique in terms of the way that was handled in a 2-acre site, taking a panoramic view of a man's entire life. That's in Abilene.
Yeah. A friend of mine who was the former site manager at the James Garfield home in Ohio, he was just named the director of the Eisenhower Library, Todd Arrington. So we've been talking with them lately about some ways to do some collaborative programming and work with them. Todd actually worked here as a park ranger early on in his career. So it's on my list to get out there. And yeah, it's so moving that they moved their first son, Dowd, there.
That's
For those
correct.
who don't know, they had a young boy named Dowd Eisenhower. His nickname was Icky, and he died at the age of 3 in 1921.
Right.
And one of the things that was so special for them about Camp Colt is it's one of the only places they lived with Icky because he died so young.
Right.
And he was initially buried out in Denver, but before Ike passed away, he saw to it that Icky's remains are reinterred in Abilene, so they would be buried side by side. It's something that's quintessential for understanding who Eisenhower was as a person, is knowing that he's a parent who lost a child, and that shaped him the rest of his life, as it does. It certainly made him a more serious person the rest of his life. He lost a little bit of his joy and humor from that incident, but it just stayed with him. There's a picture of a young Icky on the grounds of Camp Colt as a 1-year-old kid, and it just breaks your heart to see it. So Icky was here in Gettysburg with them, and that's part of our story as well.
What you have when you go to the house in Abilene where he was born, when you first enter the house and you look to the left, is a small living room where Eisenhower's mother would sit there during the Second World War with her little radio on to listen to war reports being broadcast over the radio, where she would sit and just wait for news about her son and the troops. It was interesting in terms of the entire layout of the site. Very moving site, as you indicated, Dan.
When his dad died in the spring of 42, and Ike was at the war plans office at that time. You mentioning his mother listening to the war reports made me think of this.
Right.
She was a widow at that point because his dad died in the spring of 42. Ike was running the war plans division in Washington, and he was so busy he could not travel for his own father's funeral. So on the day of his father's funeral, he sat in his office by himself and closed the door for an hour and was just alone. And that's what he did.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you. Any other questions on anything tonight?
Dan, did he have a relationship with J. Paul Getty?
I'm sorry?
Did he have a relationship, I think a financial relationship with J. Paul Getty?
Not that I know a lot about. I can't say I've really come across much on that. Well, I'm trying to remember if he was part of he was close with a number of wealthy oilmen. I'm trying to remember the specifics on, he was really close with a fellow by the name of Alton Jones, who was an executive with Citgo. He actually owned one of the neighboring properties here. I don't know much specifically about Getty.
Yeah, there's a campus up here in Rhode Island that's named the Alton Jones campus. Apparently they used to like to go fishing up there.
Yeah, he and where I am currently sitting was owned by Alton Jones before he died in a plane crash. So he and Jones are very close.
On the battlefield where Camp Colt was, were there many artifacts that were found or bones of soldiers who may have been buried on the battlefield?
Yeah, so they put in, there was a 1917 infantry training camp that was smaller than Camp Cole. And when they were building barracks and structures and putting in sewage lines for that, they did uncover remains on the battlefield.
What happened with those remains?
They reinterred elsewhere. I don't know specifically what cemetery they may have been. The place where they were, they believe they were Confederate. There are, because reburial of the dead took place for federal troops in 63 and 64. Confederates were reinterred in the early 1870s, but they did not find everyone on a landscape this large. There's no way to find quite everybody the way that the decentralized way that combat works and the lack of tracking of casualties in the 1860s by comparison with how it's done now. So over time, there have been remains found. In more recent years, remains have been moved to the National Cemetery for burial when they've been uncovered.
How about the Elliott map? Was that any help in reinterring some of the soldiers that were there?
Yeah, I mean that certainly gave a lot of locations. So that was a big source that was used. It's also just whatever markers were still there. A lot of times locals would note, there were so many buried on my property, and then they'd work with those people to rebury them. But the drawback with the Elliott map is it only covers the battlefield itself, the central battlefield. And by that I mean there's a 20-mile radius of bodies here after the battle. When you think about all the field hospitals around Gettysburg, there's a 20-mile or so radius of the dead with people in the area. So, yeah.
Do the Eisenhower grandchildren visit often?
They do, yeah. So they had 4 grandkids: David, Anne, Susan, and Mary Jean. Sadly, Anne passed away just about 2 years ago, but the other 3 do visit from time to time. I've gotten to know Susan the best of the grandkids, even have done a program or 2 with her over the years. She does bring groups by on visits to the site from time to time on tours of the house. So yeah, they all do visit. Questions?
Any other questions from folks? I have one if nobody else does. Dan, I always like to ask people who work at historic sites, or national parks in general, what is one of the most meaningful moments you have had working at your site?
There's a number of them. We do a large World War II weekend event every September. It's the largest 20th century living history event in the Park Service. About 300 reenactors here, World War II veterans. Working with the veterans, bringing World War II vets to the Eisenhower home has been special. One of them who visited us in 2022, Mr. Louis Graziano, was the last living American to witness the German surrender, and he visited the site. It was part of the event. Local guy named Melvin Hurwitz, who's a veteran with the 8th Air Force. He comes quite a bit. So it's been getting to work with the veterans, I think. But I would say in a larger sense, our site story is also meaningful in that after 3+ decades of service, the Eisenhowers finally had a place to settle down. And no sooner had they bought this place than he's asked to serve again. And nobody would have blamed Ike for saying, I'm going to put my feet up and enjoy Gettysburg. But in 1950, the world is on fire, and he has a chance to serve as NATO commander and then serve as president. And he does it. And that's part of our story.
Well, Dan, thank you so very much for staying a little later than your normal workday, I'm sure, to be with us and to speak with us this evening. Great talk. Didn't know a lot about that with Ike's connection to the Civil War in Gettysburg, so thank you very much. And I do want to echo Dan's encouragement to visit the site when you go down to Gettysburg next time. It is well worth the visit, certainly. And it's a little easier now too, right, Dan? You can drive right out to the site now and not have to take the shuttle bus.
Yeah. For 40 years, you could only get here via shuttle bus. The shuttles are no more. Come on out. We have a parking lot. We're here waiting to see you. But check our website for our hours first. So
Not this time of year, right? It's
yeah,
close.
not right now. Once it warms up.
Very good. Well, thank you, Dan, very much. And thank you all for joining us. Again, please remember our next meeting is virtual again. We're not meeting in person next month. That meeting is on Tuesday, February 25th at 6 p.m. And Ed Acorn will be joining us that evening. So be on the lookout for the Zoom link. It'll be a different Zoom link than this one coming up, and also be on the lookout for a date for the first portion of the gravestone cleaning project to do a inventory of the graves there. But thank you all for joining us. Have a great night,
Thank you,
everyone.
Mark.
See you in a month. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.